The most powerful stories often come from those who remain nameless. We give a voice to the anonymous and a face to the forgotten in our latest series of emotional dramas. Subscribe today and help us tell the stories that matter.
The quarterly review was scheduled for 8 a.m. on a Monday, which told me everything I needed to know about how my father-in-law felt about the people who worked for him. I remember sitting in the second row of the conference room at Caldwell Medical Supplies, not the back corner. I'd learned that trick early. Never sit where you can be ignored. Watching him walk in 17 minutes late without acknowledging it. My husband's father, the man I'd spent 6 years calling sir because he'd never once invited me to call him anything else. His name was my husband's name, which I always thought said something about him. Everyone called him Senior. I called him that too eventually, because it was the one word that made him respond as though I were an actual adult in the room. I'd been with the company for 4 years at that point. Hired as a logistics coordinator, promoted twice on paper, handed the workload of a third promotion without the title or the salary adjustment that should have come with it. I knew the distribution network for 17 regional hospitals better than anyone in that building, including the VP of operations, who had been brought in 8 months earlier specifically because Senior didn't trust anyone who hadn't come from outside. My name is Joanna. I'm 38. And I need to tell you what happened last March, because I still find myself thinking about it at odd moments. Standing in the grocery store waiting for coffee to brew, the particular way a life can shift without warning when someone underestimates you for just a little too long. My husband, whom I will call by his actual name, Drew, had been with the company his whole career. His father had made sure of that. Drew ran procurement. He was good at it, genuinely, and that was the thing I'd held on to for years. The idea that the job was his merit and not just his last name. I believed that for longer than I should have. That Monday review, Senior announced he was restructuring the logistics department, centralizing it under the new VP, whose name was Thad. A word I'd always thought sounded like something you'd name. A golden retriever. Thad had an MBA from somewhere that Senior mentioned every single time Thad's name came up in conversation. Thad had never managed a medical supply chain in his life. That had also, I noticed, been given an office on the 4th floor while I still sat in an open-plan bullpen on the 2nd. After the meeting, I flagged a problem with Thad's proposed new routing model. It would add 14 hours to delivery windows for 3 of our hospital contracts that had penalty clauses for delays. I wrote it up clearly. I sent it to Senior, to Thad, and copied Drew because that was protocol. Thad replied all. Thanks for the note, Joanna. We'll take it under advisement. That was February. By March, the routing change had gone into effect anyway. My sister-in-law called me the week before everything fell apart. Her name is Ren, and she is 8 years younger than Drew, and she had left the company 2 years prior under circumstances no one in the family discussed openly. She called me on a Tuesday evening while I was still at my desk at 7:30 trying to fix a delivery bottleneck that Thad's model had created. "Are you still eating lunch at your desk?" she asked. "I'm still eating lunch at my desk." She was quiet for a second. "Dad's been talking about you." I set down my pen. "Not in a good way," she said, which I already knew because there was no other kind. "He told Drew the company is over-reliant on you, that it's a liability. Being good at my job is a liability." That's not how he framed it. She paused again, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully the way she always did when she was trying to protect me from something. "He said you'd become territorial, that you were making yourself indispensable on purpose to control information." I almost laughed. I had spent 4 years documenting everything obsessively, sharing updates proactively, cross-training 2 junior staff members because I believed in redundancy. I had made myself the opposite of a single point of failure, but I understood what Senior was actually saying. The problem wasn't that I hoarded information. The problem was that he couldn't figure out how to push me out without losing things he needed. "How did Drew respond?" I asked. Ren took too long to answer. "Okay," I said. I had been approved for leave in April. 2 weeks, the first real vacation I'd taken since starting at Caldwell. Drew and I were supposed to go to Portugal. I booked it in January. I'd submitted the request through proper channels and gotten written confirmation, which I mentioned because that detail matters. 3 days before we were scheduled to leave, I found out the leave had been quietly reassigned in the system. Not denied. Reassigned. The status showed as pending reapproval, which required Senior's sign-off, which had not been given, which meant that technically I was still expected at work on Monday. I went anyway. Drew and I left on a Friday. I turned my out of office on and I got on the plane and I told myself that whatever was waiting for me when I returned, I would handle it when I returned. We landed in Lisbon at 6 in the morning local time. I remembered the light there, that specific pale gold that comes in low over the water, the way the city smells like salt and something older underneath it. And I thought, I worked too hard for a family that does not see me, and I have been doing it for 4 years. And right now I am in Portugal, and it is beautiful and I'm going to eat something good. We had dinner that first night at a small place near the Alfama district. Drew was quiet across the table from me in the way that had become familiar, present but somewhere else. One part of his attention always turned toward his phone. I didn't say anything about it. We'd had that conversation enough times that the silence had become easier. His phone buzzed twice during the appetizers. He looked at it both times. "Work?" I asked. "Dad," he said, which in our house meant the same thing. I ate my dinner. I watched the street outside the window. I told myself this was fine. The call came the next morning. I was on the terrace of our hotel with coffee, watching the river. My phone lit up with Senior's number, which he'd never called me on directly in 4 years. I stared at it for a moment. I picked up. He didn't say hello. He said, "The Mercy General delivery is 14 hours late and I'm told you're the only one who understands the routing protocol. I flagged this problem in February," I said. "That's not what I'm asking you. I'm on approved leave." "Your leave was pending reapproval." "I have written confirmation from HR dated January 28th. There was a pause. "Then, Joanna, I think you need to understand something. There are people here who've given decades to this company, real investment. What you've done is competent work, but competent work doesn't entitle you to take a vacation while the company is in crisis." I want to describe what it felt like to hear that sentence, to sit on a terrace in Lisbon in the early morning with the river and the light and the coffee going cold in my hand, and hear the man who had my career in his palm describe 4 years of 70-hour weeks and missed anniversaries and 2 promotions declined because he'd told Drew the timing wasn't right. To hear him call all of that competent work in a tone that made it sound like an insult. I said, "Is there something specific you need me to do or is this a different conversation?" He said it was a different conversation. He said that when I returned, there were going to be changes, that my role was being evaluated, that I should use the time in Portugal to think about whether my priorities were aligned with the company's direction. I recognized that language. I'd heard it used on 2 other people before they were let go. I said, "I understand," and I hung up. I sat on that terrace for a long time. Then I called Ren. She didn't answer immediately. When she called back, she was whispering, which told me she was somewhere she shouldn't be having the conversation. "He's already talked to HR, she said. "They're drafting a separation agreement." "For what cause?" "Insubordination. Abandoning responsibilities during a critical period." "I have written approval for this leave." "I know." She paused. "Joe, there's something else. Did you know that the company increased your life insurance rider last quarter?" I remember a very specific stillness in my body when she said that. The kind that isn't calm but is the thing underneath calm when something registers before you've consciously processed it. My life insurance. Through the company policy, they added a supplemental. Drew signed off on it. Drew, I want to note, had not mentioned this to me. I thought about the site audits I'd been assigned over the past 8 months. 3 of them in facilities with documented safety concerns I'd raised in writing before visiting. The last one in a warehouse outside of Memphis, where I'd gone alone because Senior had pulled my usual colleague at the last minute for a different assignment. I'd filed a report about the structural issues I observed. Thad had signed off that the issues were within acceptable range. I'd kept my copy of the original report. I sat on that terrace and I thought about those 3 audits, and the insurance rider, and the separation agreement already drafted, and Drew signing things without telling me. I thought about a lot of things in a very short period of time. Drew came out to the terrace with a second cup of coffee and said his father had called him too, that he thought maybe we should cut the trip short, head back, show good faith. I looked at him for a long moment in the Lisbon morning, this man I had loved and trusted and followed into a family that had been slowly building a case against me. And I understood something that I hadn't fully let myself understand before. "No," I said. "We're staying." He looked surprised. In 4 years of marriage, I'm not sure he'd heard me say that word in quite that register. Joe, I'll handle the Mercy General issue remotely. Email me the routing details. Dad's going to, Drew. I picked up my coffee. I looked at the river. If your father has a separation agreement ready, then the trip isn't going to change anything, so we might as well stay. He went inside. I spent the next 2 hours on my laptop, walking Thad through the routing correction by email, copying the operations team and the hospital contact directly. I documented every exchange with timestamps. I fixed the problem from a terrace in Lisbon, and I saved the emails to 3 separate places. I also called an employment attorney. I'm from Ohio originally, and my college roommate had become one, and she was the kind of person who answers on the second ring even when they're not expecting you. Forward me everything, she said after I'd laid it out. The approval confirmation, the insurance documentation, the audit reports. The audit reports might be a stretch, I said. Let me decide that. Forward everything. I did. We came home 5 days early. Not because Senior had won, but because I had finished what I needed to finish from a distance, and I wanted to be in the room for what came next. The meeting was on a Wednesday. Thad was there. HR was there. Senior was at the head of the table, and he had the particular expression he wore when he thought he'd already won something. He told me I was being let go. Insubordination, failure to be available during a critical operational period. Pattern of behavior that undermined team cohesion. He used the phrase team cohesion 3 times, which I counted. I let him finish. Then I slid a folder across the table. Inside was the written leave approval from HR. Inside was a printed log of every email I'd sent during the 5 days I was away, including the routing correction that had resolved the Mercy General issue. Inside was a copy of my original memo from February, time-stamped, showing I had flagged the problem that caused the crisis 3 weeks before it happened. I said, I'd like this meeting to continue with my attorney present. She's available by phone. Senior looked at the folder. He looked at me. I called my attorney. The next part took several weeks, which is not the same as being simple. Nothing about it was simple. Drew and I barely spoke during that period in ways that mattered. He stayed in the house. I stayed in the house. We moved around each other like 2 people navigating the same space on different timelines, which in some ways was only the acceleration of something that had been true for a while. Ren reached out to me 3 days after the meeting. She said she had something and she needed me to decide whether I wanted it, because once she gave it to me she couldn't take it back and it would change things with her family in a way that would be permanent. I told her to tell me what it was first. She had recorded a phone call, 3 weeks earlier, a conversation between Senior and the company's general counsel which she had been inadvertently patched into during a conference call that wasn't meant to include her. On that call, Senior had discussed the separation agreement, the audit assignments, and the life insurance supplemental in terms that made his intent toward me very clear. It was recorded in a 2-party state, she said. I know. I looked it up. Ren. I know what I'm doing, she said. Do you want it? I thought about what it meant that she'd held on to it, that she'd looked up the law, that she'd called me. Yes, I said. My attorney described the recording as, and I'm quoting her directly here, the kind of thing that ends depositions. The company settled. I am not able to tell you the specific terms, though I will say that my attorney was not unhappy, and I was not unhappy, and my former father-in-law looked like a man who had made a significant miscalculation about who he was dealing with. As part of the settlement, an independent audit of the company's operations was triggered by the documentation I provided to regulators regarding the hospital contract penalty clauses and the safety deficiencies at the Memphis facility. That audit found 11 separate compliance issues. The Mercy General contract was placed under review. 2 board members resigned. I want to be careful here because I've thought about this a lot. I didn't set out to destroy the company. I set out to not be destroyed by it. Those are different things, and the distinction matters to me. Dad left 6 months later to pursue other opportunities, which is how that kind of departure gets described. Drew and I separated in June. It was the quietest conversation we'd had in years, which sounds sad and probably is. But there was also something underneath it that felt closer to honesty than most of the loud conversations we'd had before. I moved into an apartment on my own for the first time in a decade, furnished it slowly, with things I actually liked, put plants in the windows, bought a coffee maker that made 1 good cup at a time instead of a whole pot I'd drink out of obligation. Ren and I still talk every week. She is living in Austin now. She laughs more than I've ever heard her laugh. I got a call in September from the director of operations at a healthcare logistics firm in Chicago. She had heard about the Caldwell situation through industry contacts, and she had a position she thought I should consider: regional director of distribution, overseeing 8 hospital networks across the Midwest. I flew out on a Thursday. I wore the suit I'd bought myself the week after the settlement, the one I'd bought for no one else. We talked for 3 hours. At the end, she slid a compensation package across the table. I thought about Senior's voice on that terrace in Lisbon. Competent work. The particular dismissal in it. The way it was meant to make me feel small in the beautiful morning light. I looked at the number on the paper. I said, "I'll need a week to consider." She said, "Take 2. I took 1. I accepted the position. I started in October. There is a thing that happens, I've found, when you spend years being careful in a space where carefulness is not rewarded. A kind of slow compression, the sense that you are taking up less room than you should because the room hasn't been offered. And then something breaks, not always cleanly, often in ways that cost you, and the compression releases, and you find out how much space you actually take up when no one is telling you to make yourself smaller. I'm not a cautionary tale. I'm not a revenge story, though I understand why it looks like one from the outside. I'm a woman who spent 4 years doing exceptional work in a building where the people making decisions had already decided what I was, and I'm a woman who found out, in the most clarifying possible way, that their decisions said nothing about me. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Standing in my apartment in Chicago, watching the lake from windows I chose, in a life that belongs to no one but me. You spend so long trying to prove your worth to people who've already made up their minds, you don't notice sometimes how much energy that takes, how much room it fills. I notice now. I've thought about Senior a lot since everything ended, not with anger, that passed sooner than I expected, but with something closer to clarity. The kind you only get when you finally stop being inside a situation and can see it from a distance. He was a man who had run a company for decades by deciding in advance what each person in the room was worth. And once he decided, no amount of evidence moved him. That's not strength. That's the opposite of it. It's a mind that stopped being curious about whether it might be wrong. What I understand now is that his plan only worked if I cooperated with it. Every part of it, the audit assignments, the insurance rider, the leave manipulation, the separation agreement drafted before I'd even returned from Portugal. Every piece of it required me to either not notice or not act. He had mistaken my patience for passivity. He had confused my willingness to document and wait with an inability to move. That's the thing about intelligence used quietly. People who are loud with their power tend to assume that quiet people have none. I was not passive. I was building a record. There's a difference, and it matters enormously. Ren understood that. She'd left the company 2 years before I did, and in those 2 years, she had watched and she had waited, and when the moment came, she had already looked up the law in her state and made a decision about what she was willing to lose. That's not luck. That's a person who had thought carefully about what was right and then found the courage to act on it when the cost became real. What she did for me took something. I think about that regularly. I try not to take it lightly. Drew is the part of the story I think about differently now than I did at the time. I spent a long time after we separated asking myself how I missed it, how I built a life with someone and didn't see for years the shape of where his loyalties actually lived. And what I've landed on is this: I saw it. I just kept reinterpreting it as something else because I needed it to be something else. That's not stupidity. That's what we do when we love people. But there comes a point where reinterpreting becomes its own kind of dishonesty, and I think I stayed past that point for longer than I should have. The consequence of all of it, the settlement, the compliance audit, the board resignations, the contracts under review, none of that was something I engineered. It was the natural result of what Senior had actually done, documented over time and placed in front of people who have the authority to act on it. I didn't destroy anything. I just stopped protecting something that had never protected me. That's the part I want to say clearly, because I think it's the part that gets lost in stories like mine. The outcome wasn't revenge, it was accountability. Those feel different from the inside. Revenge is about making someone hurt. Accountability is about making someone hurt. Accountability is about making things accurate. I wanted accuracy. I wanted the record to reflect what had actually happened. I'm in Chicago now. I have a job that pays me what I'm worth and a team that treats my knowledge as an asset rather than a threat. I have an apartment with plants in the window and a coffee maker that makes one good cup at a time. And I have, for the first time in years, the specific quiet of a life that fits. That's what I was working toward the whole time, I think. Not the settlement, not the position, not even justice in any formal sense. Just this. A life that fits. Built by someone who decided on a terrace in Lisbon in the early morning that she was done making herself smaller to stay inside a room that had never been meant for her.